that we have the ability through GoToMeeting to chat and send questions. We encourage you as we go along, if you have questions that you think of, put them in the chat box, and at the end of the webinar, we'll do our best to get to as many of those as possible. We have a lot of material to cover, but we should have plenty of time to cover it and then take your questions at the end. And with that, I don't have their announcements, so we'll go ahead and get started with the content at this point. I'm very excited to be joined by Lauren and Alyssa from VHB. VHB's been supporting VDOT over the past few months as we've worked to develop our first statewide Pedestrian Safety Action Plan. So what we're going to talk to you today about is about the issue of pedestrian safety in Virginia and give you an update as to where we are with this work effort. And also make you aware of some resources that we've created that will be available to you to help you understand pedestrian issues in your district or your area. And it's also resources that may be useful to you as you think about what types of projects to develop for safety funding or other types of funding that are available to you. I'm going to be leading the first part of the presentation and hand it over to VHB. And so Lauren's going to help advance the slides, and I think we're ready, Lauren.
Okay.
So pedestrian safety, as you may know, is critical to VDOT and is an issue of importance across the state and the country. And in Virginia, pedestrians make up a large portion of our deaths on our highway system. In 2016, they accounted for about 16% of our fatalities in Virginia. And over time, they have ranged from 10 to 15% on average of our highway deaths. 2016 saw a huge increase in pedestrian deaths, and so far 2017 is also showing elevated numbers, which is of grave concern to us. And one of our focuses in the area of highway safety is to ensure that we do everything possible to provide safe travel for all modes of transportation, including pedestrians. It's important as a state agency to provide a street and highway system that's safe for all users and that encourages all modes of transportation. There are a lot of reasons that we want to do this, and pedestrian safety is something that we're trying to understand better so that we can provide a safe transportation system. Next slide. You can see here from this chart the trend of pedestrian deaths in Virginia over the past several years as compared to the trends nationally. So in Virginia, we've tended to hover around 10 to 13% of our highway deaths are pedestrians. But as I mentioned, in 2016, we saw a huge increase that so far has continued in 2017. Last year in 2016, we saw over 120 pedestrians who died on our roadway system. You can see the national numbers have trended slightly above us for years, but we've caught up to them in recent years. So it's an issue that we continue to try to work on. Next slide. Some of the work we've been engaged in over the past couple of years is digging deeper into our pedestrian crash data to try to understand the factors that contribute to pedestrian injuries and fatalities. This chart shows the locations of pedestrian fatal crashes on our roadways in Virginia, and this is all public roads, so it's VDOT maintained roads and locally maintained roads. And what you'll see here is, like national trends, we see a large proportion of our pedestrian fatal crashes occurring between intersections at what we call mid-block locations. About 62% of our fatalities occur mid-block locations. We have a smaller portion, but still a sizable number that occur at our signalized intersections or in parking lots or unsignalized intersections. Next slide, please. When you look at all injuries, not just fatal crashes, but all injury crashes, you'll continue to see that mid-block crashes account for about half of our pedestrian injury crashes. Signalized intersections and unsignalized intersections make up about 40%, which is the next highest proportion. Next slide, please. And when you dig even a little deeper and look at injury crashes by the type of roadway that it's involved in, what you can see is that two-way undivided roads with 2 or 3 lanes, which are roads that are, the lanes are separated by a double yellow line, account for most of our pedestrian injury crashes. And you might imagine roads like this are probably where we have most of our pedestrian travel. So some of this is a function of where we have pedestrians, but most of our injury crashes occur on two-way, 2 or 3 lane undivided roads. But we also have a large number, especially on our larger arterial street system, which are noted by the divided 4+ lanes. They are in the aqua color. And so what we're seeing across the state is as the state continues to urbanize and we have more and more urban and suburban areas with these large arterials with pedestrian land uses along the sides, we're seeing a greater proportion of our injury crashes in those locations. Next slide, please. This is the same information that we just looked at in the pie chart, but it then further breaks down each of the types of roadways by where on those roadways the pedestrian crashes are occurring, whether it occurred at a signal, at an unsignalized intersection, mid-block, parking lot, or other. And we've highlighted in yellow the 2 types of roadways that we just mentioned on the previous slide. The two-way non-divided 2 or 3 lane roads is at the very bottom. You'll see the bulk of those injury crashes are mid-block crashes, followed by unsignalized intersections and then signalized intersections. And then in the middle of the slide, the other row highlighted in yellow are those larger arterial type roadways with 4+ lanes. And again, you'll see a large proportion of those crashes on those arterial type roadways being mid-block or at signalized intersections. Next slide, please. And this slide shows pedestrian injury crashes where we have a marked crosswalk in place or we don't. And so we've reviewed all the crash data in addition to reviewing the satellite imagery as to where the crashes occurred. And from that information, we're able to determine if a marked crosswalk was available where a crash happened. And when we see crash data of pedestrians trying to cross the street, certainly it indicates that there is a crossing demand at that location. And so we're trying to get an idea as to whether a marked crosswalk was present. And what you see here illustrates that in almost 90% of the locations where we had an injury crash with a pedestrian, no marked crosswalk was available. Next slide, please. We also have done a detailed look as to what the land uses are adjacent to the location where our pedestrian crashes are occurring. And this shows that commercial areas that have a lot of retail and other mixed uses, in addition to residential areas, are predominantly where we see pedestrian crashes, which makes sense because these are the areas people are wanting to walk to and walk between. Not all of our crashes are in suburban or urbanized areas, however. You will see that 12% of our pedestrian crashes occur in areas where the land uses are primarily agricultural. So farms or wooded areas do see some pedestrian crashes, but the vast majority are in more suburban or urbanized towns, cities, or counties adjacent to residential and commercial types of land uses. Next slide. Another thing that we have done as part of our analysis of pedestrian data is created what we call a heat map, which shows, kind of correlates the proportion of pedestrian injury crashes with different factors. So this slide shows that for different pedestrian refuge types, for instance, at the top of the slide, none, median, or pork chop, 1,767 crashes occurred where no pedestrian refuge island was available. And then a median was next most common, and then a pork chop had 28. And as you look down the slide, you can see we also evaluated whether pedestrian signage was present, and the vast majority of injury crashes occurred where no pedestrian signage was present. And then finally at the bottom, the type of pedestrian signal. In most locations, no pedestrian signal is available. These are just a sample of many different factors that we've looked at, and we're in the process of completing this pedestrian crash analysis report, and that will be that's a resource that's available to you. So in the future, we will keep the list of attendees from this webinar and make sure you're aware of all the resources that are available to you. Next slide, please. So the main thing we want to talk to you today about is the Pedestrian Safety Action Plan. This is the effort that VHB has been supporting us with in recent months that takes a lot of the crash data analysis information we've prepared for pedestrian crashes and helps us to develop some strategies and actions that we can undertake over the next few years to try to help pedestrian safety across the Commonwealth. And so the goals of the Pedestrian Safety Action Plan are listed here, but first it's to better understand pedestrian safety concerns throughout Virginia and to identify countermeasures to address those concerns. Also, to use that information to help identify highway safety pedestrian projects. We wanted to consider the relationship between land development and pedestrian safety, realizing that much of the roadway improvements that are made in the Commonwealth are done by private entities or land developers. And what is our role in that process of ensuring that pedestrian safety is provided for? Next, we wanted to provide this information so that it can be used as people continue to develop smart scale projects for VDOT funds. We wanted to understand more about maintenance issues for pedestrian access and safety. And then finally, we wanted to do a review of VDOT's policies, procedures, and practices to ensure that we have the best set of practices, policies, and procedures in place to promote pedestrian safety. Next slide. And one of the big, the most important parts about this effort occurs at the local level. We have a lot of great local partners around the state who many of them are experts when it comes to pedestrian travel and transportation, and we wanted to try to help get some input from those partners and also make sure that this effort helped our localities as well. As part of this effort, we've developed some priority sites and countermeasures through the PSAP process that will be shared with both VDOT district staff and localities. We're going to be asking both VDOT district staff and our local partners to look at those locations and also look at any current plans for projects or improvements at some of these locations, and to consider whether the right features are in those projects to address any pedestrian safety concerns. We are developing a process with the PSAP to identify those high crash intersections and corridors. We appreciate going forward the support of all of you to help us refine this information. Next slide, please. This is an overview of our schedule for the PSAP. We started back in May of this year, and we've been making steady progress. We did form a stakeholder team. We have a slide in a minute that shows the members of that stakeholder team, and we owe a debt of gratitude to all those folks that included both VDOT and local people to help inform the process. We've been having a series of stakeholder meetings as we've reviewed policies and practices. We've talked about risk factors for pedestrian crashes. We've reviewed a lot of crash data and hotspots and corridor information. We've begun to identify preliminary safety countermeasures that could potentially help some of the safety issues that we've seen. We wanted to have this webinar today to give all of you an update as to where we are with the process, and to give you some of the initial tools that we've created, thinking that may be useful to you because we're in the period of the year when folks are putting together their project applications for safety funds. I know those are due November 1st, so we wanted to get some information to you in case any of safety priority locations overlap with where you were thinking of doing some projects, to make sure that you had the information. We'll be continuing to work after today to develop a final report of the Ped Safety Action Plan. We expect to have that done by December. And then early next year, we plan to do several outreach events that will be located in different locations across the state to try to get maximum coverage and availability to our folks in the local areas, where we'll talk about the whole study, the resources that are available, and do some training and outreach there at the local level. Next slide. So I mentioned the stakeholder team that was developed and that has helped guide our work to date. Here are the folks who are on that team, and as I mentioned, we greatly appreciate all of their input and feedback. Had a series of great discussions and meetings as we've dove into the pedestrian information, and I've been really impressed by the dedication of this group of individuals, and value their input, and look forward to continue to working with them as we move forward. Next slide. So at this point, I'm going to hand over the presentation to my friends at VHB, and Lauren is going to take over from here. After the webinar today, I encourage any of you, if you have questions or any concerns, feel free to contact me directly, and I'll be glad to help any way I can. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Mark. So as Mark explained, I think very well, this the process is a series of steps, and it does begin in large part with a lot of the data that's been assembled and analyzed already. And then there's a lot of other important steps as well. And again, I'll reiterate what Mark said, that the work with the stakeholder team was extremely valuable, and those folks gave some very important inputs and perspectives on the process. So I'm going to talk through a series of steps that we have worked through at this point to get to where we have some preliminary countermeasure recommendations for a set of priority sites. And hopefully this won't be a terribly complicated series of information, but just let us know if you have any specific follow-up questions. All right, so the first step was to evaluate current VDOT policies and methods. And so we looked at a series of policies in different different parts of the organization, roadway design, traffic engineering, the permitting and land use elements, as well as speed setting and other safety programs and policies. This information was important because it helped us understand the baseline of where folks are currently working within pedestrian safety, as well as how the current practice is for when and where these countermeasures are being implemented. And two important resources are a couple of research reports that have been developed that specifically look at how VDOT wants to accommodate pedestrians at different types of crossings. The titles here are listed, and the information is fairly available or pretty easy to find if you do some Google searches, but I'm sure this information will be available if anybody's looking for it after the webinar. These two sets of guidance are very important to how VDOT currently makes decisions about when and where to place these countermeasures, especially the second part of this, where it discusses unsignalized locations or uncontrolled locations. And this is especially a focus for this process because of what Mark touched on earlier about the degree and volume of pedestrian crashes occurring at uncontrolled locations. So here in this second policy, the pedestrian crossing accommodations at unsignalized locations, it does include some flowcharts and design criteria for when and where to consider installing crosswalk markings and different types of treatments, such as pedestrian signals and hybrid beacons. So following the review of policy and the current processes, the next step was to look further into the data and better understand the trends and discuss some different ways of measuring risk for pedestrian crashes. And we did this in two basic ways. The first method was by creating what we call crash clusters. I'll describe that process in a little bit more in depth in just a moment. But it's very focused on the crashes, the history of crashes, the location of crashes, of pedestrian crashes, and their density. The second process was more risk-based, looking at the potential for pedestrian crashes based on a set of criteria. So that looks at a much more systemic set of variables and considering where pedestrian crashes are likely to occur, even if there hasn't been a strong history in the past. So the first process was examining what we call crash clusters. This map is an example of what that analysis tends to produce, which is a heat map, if you will, showing more dense or intense locations of pedestrian crashes. The process we looked at, we looked at the pedestrian crash data that had been geocoded for about a 5 or 6 year period, and did some analysis based on the distance between crash locations and then, of course, the density of crash locations. So all in sum, when we did that GIS analysis, we ended up, like I mentioned, with some bright orange-red spots where the density or intensity was strongest, and then some lighter green or yellow colors on the map that show where maybe the density of pedestrian crash history has not been as intense. If you were to try to identify the distinct number of places where there are clusters of pedestrian crashes statewide, we spotted around 328 total, and of course needed to find a way to prioritize that. So looking at a spread of numbers, we've identified about 19 locations where crash clusters are most intense. So this chart demonstrates that spread of the scores, if you will, of the different crash clusters. And so the important story here is there are a lot of locations where there is a cluster, but the most intense seem to be this top 19 set of locations. But I think an important message here is we definitely don't want to discourage anyone from looking at any of the other cluster sites, even if they aren't a bright red or aren't included in the 19 that we've examined more closely. So we will be producing some maps that will be published so that folks can see the wide variety of hotspot or crash cluster locations across the state and look further into those locations. And here's an example of the crash clusters in just one district. This is District 9. In the northern part of the state. And as you can see, if you look at the district as a whole, you see a lot of yellow, orange, reds, especially in urban areas, as well as along some of the major corridors, which makes sense. There's a lot more pedestrian activity in the urban areas. And then there's, of course, a lot of volumes of traffic and pedestrians along the major corridors and more outlying or suburban or rural locations. And the inset maps to the left zoom in a bit further into some of those brighter orange-red locations. And just for reference, this is where the actual PED crashes occurred in the same district. So you can see the relationship here between those bright orange-red locations and the clusters or intensities of the actual PED crash locations. So if you zoomed in a bit further into one part of that crash cluster analysis map, you would see an image like this. And I keep on comparing it to an analogy of a weather map where there's not a distinct break where a cluster stops and another one may begin, but it definitely picks up on places within a community that are perhaps more prone to having had pedestrian crashes. One note is we did not weight it towards more heavily towards the crashes that may have resulted in a severe injury or a death. All crashes for the purpose of the analysis were treated similarly when creating these crash cluster maps. And then also a bright red or orange doesn't necessarily mean that was what you could think of as like an epicenter of crash locations. It just happens to be the place where the analysis identified where the density or the proximity of the crashes were closest. But it's still a very good indicator. And if you zoomed in on those black boxes, this would be an example of what you would see on the ground. If you place the crashes back on the ground in this specific crash cluster site in Arlington, you would see that the crashes in some cases occurred at intersections, other cases at mid-block locations. So we're developing a series of what we call cut sheets. And for these crash cluster sites, the cut sheets will include a map like this, as well as information about the actual crashes that occurred at that crash location, as well as some variables about the crashes, what may have contributed to the crash types. And this is helpful information for eventually making some choices about countermeasure selection. So moving on to the priority corridors. This is the process where we didn't have as much emphasis placed on crash history, but looked at risk. This is analyzing corridors per the potential for pedestrian crashes. And so we looked for data that would be available statewide that could help inform that process. There's some good data available statewide that could help inform things like the density of the population. There's a fair amount of information in VDOT's GIS system about the road networks themselves, specifying things like speed limits or volumes or ADTs along that roadway. But then there were some layers that we wished we had had, or maybe weren't completely available to the degree we needed, that we still think would be extremely valuable, that when a more local agency wanted to look at these sites, if they have access to any of this additional data, strongly encourage you to look at that to help inform further what may be happening on the ground. So we were able to secure statewide data that talks about pedestrian destinations nearby, such as parks, trails, and schools. We also looked at whether or not the corridor was in an urbanized area or a more rural area. We were able to include posted speed limits, as well as a whole host of information about the pedestrian or the population, employment densities, vehicle ownership, a lot of information from the U.S. Census. What was missing from this, again, that would be helpful to review at a local level, are things like bus stop locations with respect to the pedestrian corridors, as well as actual speeds, if there is a speed study that's been conducted. And then, of course, information about the lighting conditions and the actual pavement markings would also be important data. So I think as this process continues to refine itself, and as other data sources are improved, such as for statewide transit layers, I think that will be important to add back into the process as the overall priority corridor analysis is reviewed. So as you might imagine, when we did the analysis, we ended up with a lot of corridors that may become a good priority. So we needed to come up with a process for filtering it down to a manageable number of corridors that we would study further. This chart explains our process for doing that. When you looked at the corridors of whatever length that were in the very top 1% of the total score, that helped us identify places overall that we wanted to consider as priority corridors. And then, of course, some of those corridors are very short segments and may have even been separated by just a few hundred feet from another priority corridor segment. So we combined those into complete links by looking at other high-scoring corridor segments. So ultimately, we wanted to make sure we had corridors that were long enough to consider from a systemic perspective, as well as ensuring that they basically fit within the same jurisdiction or same district, but we weren't completely exclusive, meaning we didn't kick out a corridor just because it crossed between two towns. So this is the process for identifying the top priority corridors with respect to finding what countermeasures would make sense. But there's a lot more out there that we still encourage agencies to explore. So based on the analysis process, this is what the priority corridors, where they're located according to districts and general regions. As you can see here, the more populated areas, again, have the higher numbers of priority corridors, and then the more rural areas have a few. This pie chart describes a little bit more detail about which districts we identified as having the highest number of pedestrian priority corridors. The Hampton Roads District and Nova, the Northern Virginia districts for sure had the largest number, which tested against our kind of basic understanding about what's happening on the ground, that those two districts do have high volumes of pedestrian traffic and have had histories of pedestrian crashes and other safety concerns. So overall, there's a little over 181 total corridors that scored fairly high, representing over 600 miles of both local and VDOT maintained streets, but about 61% of those priority corridors are on locally owned roadways. So this tells us that for the most part, the priority corridors occur at a very local level on local roadways, but they do tend to cluster in more urbanized areas. And so this is a list of some of those other traits, and won't go through each of them, but again, the layers we put into the process certainly informed the outcomes. And so where we have higher densities of population, areas with lower vehicle ownership or higher poverty, multi-lane roads, higher volumes, and higher posted speed limits, all of those factors resulted in the corridors that ranked highest as far as priority for the risk of pedestrian crashes. And so very quickly, I'll just show how these beads, as I call them, the high priority beads, kind of string together into a priority corridor. These colors represent the scores, and so a magenta color represents a 1% piece of a corridor. Red is within the top 10. You string them together into cohesive corridors, and the blue lines is essentially what you see form. And then you zoom in on one of those priority corridors, and this is an example in the Hampton Roads District along Chesapeake Boulevard in Norfolk. It is a multi-lane road, and so what we'll end up doing with this is creating, again, these cut sheets to describe the corridor more thoroughly and some of the countermeasures that might work best. So that is a very brief summary of the analysis that we went through. And then, of course, an important part of this is identifying countermeasures. So a couple key points here. We looked at countermeasures that have been highlighted by organizations such as Federal Highways as proven or well-established countermeasure types. We looked at a lot of guidance through organizations or resources such as PedSafe that's maintained by the Highway Safety Research Center, as well as a number of reports that are produced by the Transportation Research Board. And then, of course, the VDOT policies are an important part of this, making sure that countermeasures we're recommending are consistent with either policies that VDOT currently have or policies that VDOT may be considering changing. And again, just reiterating, we'll be focusing on what we looked at as the top % of priority sites, but there are lots of priority corridors out there that we encourage local agencies to look at. And so you could consider following a method like we have to select countermeasures for those same sites. And of course, when you see a priority corridor, your town, city, or district may already have planned something for those sites. And that actually makes sense that if you've noticed a history or you've heard complaints that you've already planned something. So certainly take that planned project or planned improvement in consideration when comparing that against some of the countermeasures that we'll be recommending. There are a lot of countermeasures out there that we considered, and I'll just quickly go through some of those that we recommended more often than others, just to give you a sense of what types of countermeasures will be included in the report. Two types of common countermeasures we recommended are things like high visibility crosswalk markings, as shown in the photo to the left, as well as curb extensions where that's feasible, maybe at an intersection, but in some cases, mid-block crossing locations can also include a curb extension. So these have the benefit, of course, of enhancing the visibility of the pedestrian in the crosswalk. Another pair of countermeasures that we've recommended multiple times are pedestrian countdown heads, or in other cases, VDOT may be looking at installing automated or countdown heads that are specifically designed for visually impaired. And so we'll be recommending treatments like this, especially where pedestrian crashes occurred at intersections, perhaps maybe because they didn't have sufficient crossing time. Leading pedestrian intervals are another countermeasure type that we've recommended multiple times, and that will, of course, address the same issue where pedestrians are needing a little bit more time to be able to cross the street. Another pair of countermeasures you'll notice in the report will talk about things like signage, advanced warning signage ahead of a crosswalk or a crossing, or in the crossing or in the street, in-street yield signage. And so we'll look at those, especially where the pedestrian risk is greatest at non-controlled or uncontrolled crossing locations. Another pair of crossing countermeasures that will be discussed are more controlled crossing types. So a pedestrian hybrid beacon, which is not a formal traffic signal, but it is a traffic control device. And this is especially effective at multi-lane roads with higher speeds and higher volumes. So this will be a recommendation, especially for those major arterials where there's a significant risk for pedestrians to be hit. And then other treatments such as rectangular rapid flashing beacons may be another good tool to enhance pedestrian crossing visibility. And so all of these countermeasures will be described in more detail in the report in case you have any questions about what it is or maybe some of the data about that particular countermeasure and its effectiveness. Another pairing is, as Mark mentioned earlier, that there was a large percentage of pedestrian crashes that occurred where there was not a refuge island or median in multi-lane conditions. So this is a good countermeasure for situations where you do have pedestrians hit at multi-lane roadways, and especially if there's an opportunity to place the median inside a two-way turn lane. Road diets are another countermeasure commonly associated with allowing for bike lanes, but they also help reduce the crossing distance for pedestrians. So this is also a countermeasure, especially where other data is taken into account, such as traffic volumes and speed and other traffic data. And lastly, a couple pairings that are not so much about crossing the street, but very important pedestrian safety treatments are continuing to plug gaps in the sidewalk network where those gaps are noticed, and then as well where there are bus stops, improving the pedestrian network to include wide sidewalks, level landing pads, as well as mid-block crossings at those locations would be good treatments to consider, especially where you have high volumes of pedestrian traffic or transit users. So again, we looked at a whole variety of data when looking at the priority corridors and crash cluster sites. We looked at the travel lane number, the speed limit, traffic volumes, whether or not there is a median or a refuge island. We looked at relative pedestrian volume or activity, so where it's nearby a major destination, that also tells us a bit more about the expected volumes of pedestrian traffic. And then, of course, looking at crashes where available to see if there's anything more we can glean from the crash reports about some of the contributing factors to pedestrian safety. Here's an example of a hotspot or a crash cluster cut sheet. This example looks again in Fredericksburg in District 6. And in this case, the crash cluster has a series of crashes that occurred, some at intersections and others at uncontrolled locations. So we'll provide these statistics with these cut sheets for each of the priority sites. We'll also talk about the posted speed limit and the number of crashes that occurred either due to an action of the driver or may have been affected by whether or not the crash happened during the day. So all of that comes together to give some guidance on whether the the crossing locations would benefit from things like curb extensions to help maybe slow traffic, or parking restrictions to improve visibility of the pedestrian while crossing, or if there's a lot of pedestrian crashes occurring in nighttime hours, that would be a situation where you would recommend lighting improvements. And another example of a crash cluster site, this one is in Charlottesville. Similar, more crashes occurred here, so there's a bit more information to cull through. But in this case, most of the crashes occurred on 2-lane roads, and it certainly impacts what types of countermeasure treatments we would consider. So in this case, a 2-lane road with crashes that occurred at a lot of uncontrolled or mid-block crossing locations may spell the need for raised crosswalks or enhanced marked crosswalks, as well as maybe advanced or in-street yield signage. So there's certainly a different package of countermeasures for the different conditions. And then one more example of a crash cluster site. This is Winchester, similar 2-lane undivided road, lower posted speed limit. And a lot of the crashes here occurred because the driver didn't yield to the pedestrian, perhaps in a marked crosswalk. So this perhaps spells the need for some restrictions on intersection movements, maybe a consideration for a restriction on right turn on red movements, or including a leading pedestrian interval to give the pedestrian an opportunity to get into the street before the vehicle moves into the crosswalk. So I'll go through a few examples of the priority corridors, and then we'll getting closer to the end. So an example of a crash cluster or a corridor site, these maps are big, they're big scale, and so I think an overall recommendation would be that local agencies and others would, once they understand that there is a corridor of priority significance in their community, they should certainly look at it further. We'll be able to provide a general location and some information about ADTs and speed limits, but certainly encourage you to, once you find the location, go visit the site, look at it in more detail and other aerial imagery, and see if there's anything more that can tell you more about the pedestrian safety risks. This one in Richmond is a 2-lane roadway with lower to moderate speed or traffic volumes with a 35 mile per hour posted speed limit. In this case, there's a fairly high volume of pedestrian activity with some on-street parking. And I think when you pull this site into other applications like Google Maps, you'll be able to see some of the reasons why there are high volumes of pedestrian activity. For example, when it's close to a major university, that certainly explains a lot there. So in this case, we would recommend, based on what we can tell from the information, that things such as curb extensions, high-vis crosswalks, and or signal improvements could really help pedestrian safety across the corridor. Another example, this is a multi-lane roadway in Norfolk, and it's a much higher volume, higher posted speed limit. So this begins to speak to the need for pedestrian refuge islands or other types of pedestrian signal heads at signalized intersections, high-vis crosswalks, and or other types of countermeasures such as hybrid beacons. So we're trying to pair the countermeasures with the conditions based on what we know about the traffic volumes and speeds and other variables. And one more example, this one is in Roanoke County, 4-lane median divided roadway in a more suburban type context, and a very high volume, high speed limit, with very little in the way of pedestrian crossing infrastructure. So there's a lot of opportunity for things to happen here. placing in median islands or hybrid beacons along with a high-vis marked crosswalk at very strategic locations would be a good path forward here, as well as looking at increasing or improving the gaps in sidewalks or paths along the road. So where there's a lot of pedestrian traffic expected, but little in the way of infrastructure, this definitely speaks to being one type of priority corridor. So before we go into some of the policy recommendations, I'll just, before we leave the corridors, all that to say is we'll be producing a series of cut sheet maps for every priority corridor that we've identified. And once you learn that there's a priority corridor in your community, I think what we'll suggest is that districts or local agencies would contact Mark Cole and VDOT to acquire that cut sheet so that you can study your site further.
Actually,
yep.
Lauren, before we move on
yep.
to the policy recommendations, can we just check with everyone, is anyone still experiencing a lag in the slides, or are you all seeing the policy recommendation slide? If you're still experiencing a slide, feel free to speak up, or if you're still experiencing a lag, feel free to speak up or put it in the message pod. Thanks.
Ah, I see. Thank you. I'll try to speak more slowly or get a bit further. All right. Thank you for mentioning that, Alyssa. So just very briefly on policy, there's the landscape of pedestrian safety recommendations and guidance is a very fast-moving landscape. So we're looking at things that are happening at the national level and considering how those could help inform policy improvements for Virginia. And a few things that we may be considering for some policy recommendations are things like more specific guidance for when and where to install specific countermeasures. So for example, VDOT may consider developing installation or design guidance for pedestrian hybrid beacons. And that could certainly take many cues from MUTCD and other important resources, but there may be more information that VDOT wants to add to the specific installation guidance there. Same for lighting. So given the percentage of pedestrian crashes that occur at night, may speak to the need for specific policy to give guidance on when and where and how to install lighting at pedestrian crossings. A lot more information has been published recently that explains that, you know, lighting needs to be placed very specifically so that it doesn't cast shadows on pedestrians, but while still illuminating the crosswalk. And then other things could be improved for mid-block crossing type locations, such as enhancing existing policies to add in to matrices to talk about, you know, well, if you did include a hybrid beacon at a place, how would that impact level of service for pedestrian safety? Another example is intersection policy. So going back to some of those VDOT policies we spoke of earlier, there may be ways to thread in either warrants or other design guidance for when and where to install things like leading pedestrian interval signal types. Also, maybe there's some improvements for the current traffic impact analysis guidance, and maybe some special attention towards whether there's a measure for levels of service about how long it takes a pedestrian to cross the road, given the width of a roadway. And then other tools could be improved upon or looked at for just improving how development process looks at pedestrian safety, not just whether the sidewalk is being constructed as part of the new roadway, but how the pedestrian is actually allowed to enter the site and access businesses on site. And long-term policy recommendations may include things like looking at if there's some design guidance for when and where VDOT would install or consider road diets. And there are some examples in other states that could be looked at there. I think an interesting idea that's come up through this discussion is if you have a priority corridor and you can begin thinking through some of the countermeasures, what else could you do there? And this may be an opportunity for, similar to how school zones are established, maybe there's a different type of priority zone, pedestrian priority zones, where you look at other types of treatments or countermeasures such as enforcement or speed management. And then other policies for continued review or when and where sidewalks should be placed on one or both sides of the street relative to land use, and other things such as just checklists for development review to make sure it's looking at all aspects of pedestrian safety. So that is a very brief summary of the process and where we are today. And we do have a bit more to do. The next steps for this PSAP is to create project recommendations at the short, mid, and long-term level. So taking another look at all of those priority sites and putting them into a series of horizons for maybe when some of them should happen sooner than others. And then same for the policy recommendations, which recommendations should be followed up on sooner than later. And we do expect, as Mark said, to produce a final report including all of these crash cluster and corridor site maps, as well as a lot of other data by the end of the year and next spring, following it up with a series of workshops to explain more about the process and how other partners can use this data. And of course, there is a lot more for folks to help with examining these sites further. I think by early next week, we'll have published some maps that show the locations of the crash clusters as well as these priority corridor sites. And Mark, maybe you can speak to this. I think once we've published that as well as downloaded the recording of this webinar, that the links to those maps will be available on a VDOT site for either webinar participants or the general public to be able to follow through on. Is that correct?
Yes, Lauren. So what we will do is once we decide the best way to get the maps online is we will send a link to both the maps and the recorded webinar out to the distribution list that was on this meeting. And of course, that can then be shared with others who maybe couldn't participate or who is interested but wasn't on the invitation list. So we'll send some correspondence to everyone that has links to all that information.
Okay. And so hopefully those maps will be user-friendly so that you can easily spot where these priority sites have been located and look further into some of the others that may not have developed a cut sheet for them. And then, of course, another important step is once you've identified that there is a corridor or a cluster site in your area that should be examined further, I would suggest that you would coordinate review of that with local VDOT staff or local municipal staff to talk about what projects have already been planned there. To look at crash reports in more detail, talk to law enforcement and others to see if there's something else that could help inform the countermeasures. And so the cut sheets will give some recommendations for countermeasures, but certainly that will need to be spot checked in the field to ensure that it would work given all the physical constraints. And last but not least, with the list of sites and the prospective countermeasures, as Mark mentioned in the beginning, one important goal of this is to be able to give some ideas for projects that the department as well as others could submit for HSIP funding. And my understanding is that deadline is November 1st, and you could visit the link here to develop and submit an HSIP project, perhaps from one of these sites, or if one of these sites give you other ideas of other places, then that may be a helpful next step. And with that, I think we've covered most of what we wanted to talk about today. So questions? I see. Oh, go ahead.
Are you ready? On one of your slides, it said 61% of the crashes are in locally controlled streets. Now, most people at VDOT define that as the urban system, which are localities with a population of 3,500 or greater. Did you work with that list when you came up with that 61%?
That's my understanding, but we'll double check that.
Okay. For those, first of all, I was actually surprised the 61% wasn't higher.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that figure actually surprised me in a good way, because if 49% are on VDOT roads, that's roads that people at VDOT have more control over potentially. The other thing is, for those 61% that we think happened in the urban system, have those localities been provided with this information?
I don't think that well, when you say this information, are you talking about the specific locations of where these priority corridors and cluster sites are located?
Yes.
Okay. Well, that is basically the next step that hopefully will happen very soon. So those ArcGIS online maps that I very briefly mentioned, when they've been published, which we expect will be done by the end of the week or early part next, and the links are posted to VDOT's website, you should be able to click on the link, visit the map, and then see the locations of those priority corridors and crash cluster locations.
So should the VDOT district planners be working real closely with those localities to make them aware of this information, since it's so close to the November 1st deadline?
I think that's a very good idea.
Morning. Can you hear me? Okay, yeah. This is Joe Bonanno with the West Piedmont Planning District Commission, Danville MPO. Well, these maps that are, that are produced, the cluster and corridor maps, will they be allowed to be used as bases for smart scale applications, kind of like the top 100 crash locations, in each VDOT district? Sort of showing a safety issue?
Mark, do you want to?
Hey, this is Stephen Reed speaking. I definitely would hope so. The smart scale projects go through a screening process.
Right.
And part of that screening for when there's more of a safety emphasis for the project is to look to see if there are crashes there that support that application. And so most definitely, anything that you could glean from this and include in your application will streamline that process of screening it in. And then, of course, the death and injury crashes are used in the actual score. So anywhere where you actually have these collisions will definitely support, improving your safety score. So on two fronts, this information will be helpful for your application on smart scale as well.
Great. And, well, that's great because, we do have some localities in the past and currently looking at pedestrian projects. And just one other thing, I noticed that, you mentioned the HSIP, applications due November 1st. We have one or two localities that are thinking of doing TA and or safe routes to school applications. If there are any clusters in that area, would any of these maps be applicable to those projects for attachments?
Yeah, I would certainly say that definitely supports your purpose and need statements for each of those programs as well.
Okay.
And so, yeah, they're not as driven maybe by the data, but it definitely identifies purpose and need for sure for TAs and the other, even revenue sharing as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
And this is Mark Cole. One thing to keep in mind, of course, Stephen and I and others are working with the Highway Safety Improvement Program funds.
Right.
And so we're really encouraging folks to submit for those types of projects, but we're hopeful that this information can be used to submit for a variety of different funding types, or even you could use it to help justify spending local funds, or we don't have a favorite type of funding, but we just hope that the information can be used to help you find funding to do these types of projects.
Great, thank you.
Any other, feel free to add a question to the chat pod. I know most people are muted, so if you have a question, send it out there and we can try to address it there.
The ArcGIS layers, will they be hosted on the VDOT organizational account? So would we be able to use those in case we wanted to make like another map or integrate them into other maps we have?
Yeah. So our current plan is to post them on VDOT's ArcGIS online account. Okay. We're working through that now, and hopefully we'll have links within a couple days to share. Yeah.
I did want to add one thing, just as a clarification or additional information for people. This is Mark Lipschultz from VDOT's Traffic Engineering Division. The presentation mentioned the policy that we already have, the INIM 384, that is on pedestrian accommodations at unsignalized intersections. And then our division is also working on developing similar guidance and policy specifically for pedestrian accommodations at signalized intersections, as well as policy, looking at policy for audible pedestrian signals for the blind and visually impaired. And then specific to lighting, I will add, that's something that's been kind of a hot topic of late. VDOT has started moving in a big way to LED lighting. So in the past, I think a lot of agencies have been hesitant to recommend lighting improvements because it was very expensive both for initial installation as well as for ongoing maintenance. That's gotten a lot better now with the advent of LEDs. They've gotten a lot more cost effective. I could really talk your ear off about that if anyone's interested. But just know that that's something that we're kind of considering specifically is what should be VDOT's policy regarding lighting, both at intersections as well as maybe even at mid-block locations.
Great.
Also, it looks like we have a question here from Eric Stringfield. What was the last statement about district planners making sure localities know about the information? And Eric, I believe that the question was from the localities, was that since the HSIP application deadline is coming up soon, if they would be able to work with district planners to, to get their projects in time. And for us, we were saying that would be our hope.
Yeah, and this is Mark Cole. I just sent a response on the chat to Eric as well, but of course, we're going to send the links to the information out, and we encourage all of you to share with others as you see fit, and then we'll continue also to push information through our local assistance division and district traffic engineers and district planners, because it takes all of us to make sure that the communication continues to flow.
Good point. Well, if there are any other questions, feel free to throw them in there, but that may have hit on most of the questions. I've gone back through the chat pod, and I think we have addressed most of the questions either through the material or through specific chat pod responses. Any other questions in the folks on the phone? Those who have audio capabilities, at least.
It looks like we have one more question here about how to obtain police reports for crashes identified in a priority corridor. And so based on that ArcGIS online information, I think that there's probably a couple different ways that you could get it. One, I think crash data is available through VDOT's ArcGIS online, but I think Tableau would be a good resource to use that and pull the specific crash data. Mark, do you have anything to add about how folks could obtain specific crash data?
Yes. So we have, of course, access to all the crash reports in the state. DMV maintains that information, and then VDOT has access and uses the detailed crash report information for our studies as well. So the information that we'll send you that shows the crash locations should have a document number attached with each of those numbers, and we can use that document number. You can either obtain the crash report if you don't have a local system that helps you with that information. You can obtain that from DMV, or if you have questions, we can help you here at VDOT as well to know the best way to do that. So I would encourage you, if you don't currently have a system in place to obtain police crash reports, feel free to contact me directly, and I can help connect you to the people who can get you that information.
Very good.
About the tableau.
We have one other thought here from Tina Simmons.
Yeah, about the tableau, you can copy and paste those document numbers into Tableau, and it's got a lot of underlying data. It's got a lot of the fields, like, you know, number of vehicles, type, you know, very specific information. A FAR 300 report by document number, including crash description. So that should maybe be a good first step.
Yeah, it's a good point. VDOT does publish an online tool that's available to anyone with web access. It's called the Tableau Crash Tool, and it has a lot of great information about all crashes in Virginia, pedestrian crashes included. We can certainly include a link to that tool in the email we'll send you with all the other information. For localities that don't have a way to access crash data, the Tableau tool should give you a lot of great information and get you started, including the report for the actual police report. Thanks, Tina.
Very good. Anything else? And I see Alyssa just posted the link to the Tableau site in the chat pod. Well, if there are no other immediate questions, then I think we may be done. Mark, thank you. That was excellent. Do you have any other kind of closing comments?
Thank you, Lauren. Appreciate VHB's support with today as well. And I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your schedule. I know everyone's busy, and this was a lot of time to ask from you. But hope you found the information valuable, and we look forward to hearing input from you and any questions you may have, because ultimately our goal is to share information in the hopes that we can start to make a difference and improve pedestrian safety on all our roadways. So thank you so much, and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.